Hello and welcome back to the BAC podcast and episode 4 as we delve into all things performance with the BAC Mono Supercar. Now, Mono is recognized as the ultimate performer on the road and track and boasts more than 10 production car lap records around the globe. So hopefully in this episode, we're going to find out exactly how that's been achieved. Helping me shed some light are the BAC co-founders, Neill and Ian Briggs. How are we, boys?
Good, mate. How are you?
Very, very good. Neill?
Yeah, no, we're good. All set for another episode.
Good.
Looking
Can't wait.
to it.
Let's get stuck in. So we established in episode 3 that Mono's performance was the very first thing you guys thought about when it came to creating the car. So what were you aiming to create in terms of performance? And did the finished result actually surpass your expectations?
I think, firstly, obviously, we know already about the singularity of purpose of the car, which defines its layout, etc. And once you've got the base architecture of the car, you're into essentially a systems exercise of defining various different targets. And obviously that's where the push rod suspension came from, and the central driving position allows you to really optimize the kinematics of the suspension. It comes from some basic targets, really, in terms of the different geometry we've got on the suspension, from everything from defining the static camber, and then through to what we call the camber gain, to how the wheels articulate, what you want to do with the wheel at particular movements, and then of course how you control it through the springs and the dampers, what the ride frequency target was to try and give a certain level of plushness to the ride on both the road and the track. So ultimately, all of those things came together. Obviously, it was built on a lot of our previous experience of working on other projects. So there was a high level of expectation in terms of how the car would perform. But of course, the only time you ever really get to understand that is when you physically drive the car and ultimately test the car against the stopwatch, which is the benchmark. There's no arguments with that, and that was really the beginnings of it all, really.
I know from my point of view, it was less technical in the way Neill kind of saw it. I had a feeling, again, like the design of the car, I had a feeling of what it would feel like to drive the car. It kind of grew from an earlier conversation. I don't know if we mentioned it on another podcast, but long journey in a truck. Long story short, a very successful racer had told me what it's like and how Formula cars respond to driver inputs and things. And doing track days with various other cars, I knew that wasn't the case with the cars I owned, and so I had this imagination of going into a hairpin and just how direct everything would feel and how precise it would feel like when I was racing karts. And so that very first drive, the very first drive was, as we've mentioned before, in the night around a car park, but at the Verve street race, where I did actually get to drive it properly around albeit a street circuit, and not at 10 tenths by any means, 7, 8 maybe. It was great to feel that this you're sitting in the middle, it responds left and right exactly the same. It's we forget how unusual it is to sit off to one side of a car until we go to a foreign country, rent a hire car, and suddenly find ourselves on the opposite side, and we realize that our mind is completely corrected for being off to one side. You go into a right-hand corner in a left-hand drive car and the car sinks, and you go into a left-hand car, the car lifts you up, and there's none of that. You're just in the middle. Everything's rotating, around you, rolling around you. It was a great feeling.
And then at that point, as I say, once you've defined, in the design stages, the so-called hard points of what the car was, you're then into a tuning exercise, and that's where the support came in from our supplier, ZF Sachs Racing at the time, who supplied the dampers, and they'd kindly offered to give us some days on their 4-poster tuning rig in Germany. So I trundled off down there with the car in the back of the truck, and we dropped it on the rig, and that's when you start getting into the real technical aspects of what damping you want in certain areas, how the car is in terms of pitch sensitivity, roll sensitivity, one wheel bump, say for example, when you're going over a curb on a track or you're hitting a pothole on the road. And all of these things you can tune, and that's how a vehicle dynamics or a vehicle engineering person earns their money, in essence, really. And obviously it was something which I've been doing for many years, to great effect with other businesses and other products. So for me, that they're the kind of days where you can sort of immerse yourself in the technical details. But then luckily in Schweinfurt, where the four-poster rig was based, they've got some great roads on mountain roads, and we basically came up with 2 or 3 different setups with the car. And then it's a question of putting that quantitative data next to some subjective data, which basically means driving the car, obviously. And there was a mixture of motorway, A roads, B roads, undulations, all various different surfaces, and basically spent quite a long time tuning the car on the road, as well as what we'd done on the four-poster, and picking one of those 3 optimum setups that we'd painstakingly developed over the time on the rig, and that ultimately was what we called the base setup of the car. And then from there, you then obviously release that setting to the damper supplier, and that's how he delivers the dampers to us. But from then on, it was a question of trying to then be able to offer customers the opportunity to tune their cars to their personal style of how they particularly like the car to drive. Some people prefer a car to have a small amount of understeer. Some people prefer oversteer. Some people prefer a very neutral car. And just basically coming up with some tunable settings on the dampers, which of course are adjustable. So it allows the customer to be able to tune the car to his or her preference. And that was the next stage of the development process. And obviously that involved quite a lot of track testing. And that's when, even though I'd achieved what I'd achieved in my relatively short racing career, it's only then that you realize that you need a driver on a completely different level to yourself, who can be a machine and a metronome, and just, lap after lap after lap exactly the same, drive exactly the same. And then, if you've made a technical change, you can quantify it on the watch. And of course, that's when we started to look around for a potential partner in a driver. And it was quite an interesting journey. I think Ian and I actually saw the same footage of an interview on a Grand Prix. It was at Barcelona, I believe.
Oh, it was Hockenheim. Hockenheim.
Yeah, and Ian and I both, although we were in different locations, saw the same piece. And they obviously interviewed this new hotshot, up and coming young man who was 18, I think 19 at the time, and just the way he conducted himself, the way he spoke, and everything was a great start. The fact he was leading the Formula 3 championship was perfect for us in terms of the performance of our car versus a Formula 3 car. Very, very similar in terms of straight line speed, marginally quicker actually in our case. And so we thought, right, here's someone who's hungry, who we can work with. And it just turns out that they were based just down the road from where we were based, in Cheshire at the time. And that really then started the journey of working with our old friend Oliver Webb.
Just to back up slightly, what was very telling on the interview, I mean, he was very, very, very eloquent, very professional. Obviously, his driving, the position he was in the championship showed him as being a good driver. But when the camera cut back to Eddie Jordan, whoever it was who was with him, Eddie he's like, can I just say, I'm proud of our industry when we bring young guys into the industry, and our industry makes them as eloquent and as professional as that young man just was. He was impressed at how professional a job on camera Ollie had just done. So yeah, I've got goosebumps now actually thinking about it. It seems crazy, but it was quite a moment.
Yeah, and I think from there onwards, Ollie and I formed Ollie obviously gets on very well with everybody in the company, but Ollie and I formed a really good bond and relationship, because in essence, Ollie was the professional driver that we needed, but we're not selling the car to professional racing drivers, of course, depending on how people's skills develop. they can get closer and closer and closer towards the speed of a professional driver. But ultimately, the car is aimed at a certain type of individual. And I guess I'm a pretty good cross section of those people. And so in essence, what Ollie and I would do is when we would test parts on the car and we would test changes, Ollie would assess it, and we'd be able to use him as the metronome, testing the baselines and the various different changes. And then I'd jump in and I'd assess the change almost from a customer perspective, in essence, to make sure that we'd hit the sweet spot with where we wanted the car to be, and almost had this kind of telepathic understanding, really, of what a customer would want. And of course, at this stage, we haven't even handed over the first customer cars, so it was obviously, there's a certain leap of faith in him and obviously in our own skills, as it had been for the entire journey up to that point, to make sure that the car was going to drive as well as it looks and that it delivered in every single aspect. And I think the rest is history, and the fact that we've got so many lap records and actually 3 of those have been set by our customers is testimony to the fact of just how accessible the car is, what a joy it is to drive. But also, we talk about lap records, which as an engineer is the ultimate accolade and the ultimate, litmus test. But for me, some of the best drives I've ever enjoyed have been on the road, particularly with the Mono Owners Club. 8 or 10 cars all line astern driving over the top of a ski resort in, I think it was France, last year, for example. And there's several hundred people all just stopping in their tracks to see all these insects, just tripping over the top of this mountain, incredible views, really interesting people. And then, we were doing 10 or 15 miles an hour. It's not about oversteer or understeer or breaking a lap record at that point. It's how something makes you feel. And I think that's the thing that's hard in this situation, to explain to people how the car makes you feel.
Try.
Well, I mean, there's been some great quotes over the years. I think the piece by Evo, when they drove the car around Anglesey, I think Dickie Meaden did a brilliant job of explaining who we are and what the car is all about. But his words were, "It's like nothing else," and I think that those words, although very simple, says it all, really. It is like nothing else. You sit in the middle. Certainly, it's like nothing else in terms of a conventional automotive road experience, for sure. Those people who've driven, fortunate enough to have raced and driven formula cars, for them it'll be, it's what they're used to. And in many ways, that's what we're selling. We're selling that race car dream, I guess. But sitting in the middle, being exposed to the elements, I say exposed, you're actually cocooned inside the car. So it's not as if there's any serious buffeting that you get from the wind at all. Certainly not below 100 miles an hour. And it is, you've got nothing in your field of view. When we sit in our daily road cars, we have A pillars, we have B pillars, we have seats, we have dashboards, and actually the piece of glass that you look out of with mirrors and sensors for gates and garages and all these different things these days, it's quite an obscured vision that you have, actually. And with our car, you can almost see, not quite 360 degrees, but certainly 270 degrees right behind you. You can see all around. There's this freedom that you get instantly. And then, of course, the fact that you're on your own and that you can feel the car gives you this feedback like nothing else. There's an incredible sense of solitude, I have to say, because you're not being distracted by satellite navigation or phone calls or anything else, and you can just focus on what you're doing, and it can be incredibly relaxing and peaceful if you're on the road. And then, of course, depending on what speed you go in, it can demand all your attention and just give you a thrill like nothing else.
I think Neill touched on an interesting point there. He made the suggestion that, unless you've driven a formula car, you probably, you've not experienced it, which is correct. Having said that, even those formula guys who've driven formula cars, they're driving with helmets on, which you don't always have to do in mono. And they've certainly not driven at road speeds on the road in that car with suspension that's been optimized to work in that environment. So even a formula driver's not driven through a lovely windy road through a forest with a pair of sunglasses on, only doing 30, 40, 50, 60 miles an hour. That's one of the things, It is a very fast car, and it's about going fast and all the rest of it and its performance. But I remember I drove it back. There was an event here in Germany. I drove it back from a race, interestingly, from the Solitude Ring, and an old F1 circuit. And that idea, that what Neill mentioned about that feeling of solitude, it reminds me a little bit when I was doing track days on a motorbike, or when you're skiing. It's quite a social thing. You're on the lift, you're talking with your friends, but when you put your goggles down and you put your hands back into your gloves and you push off on your skis, or you put your helmet on and start your motorbike, your social interaction with everyone around you all suddenly become just about that thing you're doing, and the focus of that solitude. There's a real purity to that. But what I wanted to mention was, you do 40, 50 mile an hour down just a windy country lane. You're not even, you're not even going at a quarter of what the car's performance can do. But every car we drive nowadays, with the exception of mono, of course, it's about insulating you from the environment. It puts windscreen and doors and air conditioning and soundproof and all these things. And that's great. If you want to drive from Stuttgart to Berlin and have a business meeting, you want to arrive fresh. That's not a criticism of those cars. But we take for granted a little bit the speed at which we're moving through the environment. And when you're suddenly out there and the wind's blowing on your t-shirt and you feel the warm air, and as you drive into a forest, you suddenly sense the cool air, you smell the forest, you're aware of the shade, and a little chill goes over you. And you'd have to be going fast. There's just this wonderful feeling of moving through the world, and everything's being delivered to your body. It's hard to describe, and I sometimes worry, when we're always talking about lap records and everything, is that we perhaps don't put enough emphasis on that, because you drive that car at 30, 40 mile an hour, just nice and like, and just drive it down a lovely windy lane, not even fast, and it's just a joy to be out in the world moving along.
I remember one of my most memorable experiences, believe it or not, was in central London. Was driving along the embankment. I pulled up at some traffic lights. There was a motorbike alongside me. He was looking at the car. There was I think it was a BMW next to me or something. And I just thought I'll pull away, and I'll just run it through the gears, obviously within the speed limit. And I kind of looked around me, and these things were nowhere to be seen in the background. And I realized I was doing 45, 50 miles an hour, backed off a bit. I could see Big Ben, and I could see the river, and there's people stopping and taking photographs. And I just had a t-shirt on. I just had some sunglasses on. I turned up at the traffic lights, and people were getting off a bus to come and take photographs of me in the car. And I suddenly realized, this is more than how the car makes you feel. It's how you and the car together, and how you interact with the environment and other people can make you feel as well. And of course, you can be as anonymous as you like with a helmet on, or you can be well known and just wear your sunglasses. But that was a city centre drive for me, and it was only and of course there was lots of traffic involved as well. And it's a completely different situation to do something. But then, as Ian says, when you put your goggles on, or your gloves on, or your helmet on, a bit like when you finally get to be on the grid and everyone's disappeared when you race. And it's not about, TV interviews or talking to sponsors or this or that, the other. It's just you, and I'm now going to race. It's very much like that with everything else you've got going on in your life of emails and messages and phone calls and so on. Is that the car just takes you to this nice place, and allows you to just enjoy your sport or your hobby of driving.
I get that a lot. So I get asked a fair amount of events and stuff, have you driven the car and what's it like? And the first time I actually did drive the car it was from the paddock at Anglesey to like a second car park, which I believe was like the old track, right? Up there. And I remember I was yelling, like as in roller coaster style yelling, like sort of not hands in the air, of course. And I remember looking down at the wheel, and it said 37 miles per hour. And I was just like, that's absolutely pathetic. But it's that good a feeling doing whatever. And I remember Tiff Nadell said, he was driving 60 in North Wales. And he famously says, it feels like I'm doing 160, because it's that sort of exhilarating feeling.
Yeah, because most other cars that have filtered all the information that's coming to your body that gives you that info, and suddenly when you get it completely undiluted, it can be a bit overwhelming at first. I know guys who've test driven the car, and I said, the first time I went out, there was just such a lot going on. I'm getting so much sensory information. It was a little bit overwhelming, but by the time I went out the second time, I'd I'd kind of normalized to that, and I was able to enjoy it and all the rest of it. And so, yeah, there is a lot of info coming there, but that's why you're doing it, isn't it? I mean, that's why you pick an open top single seater supercar. You want that.
So we know obviously Mono is amazing on the road, but we cannot ignore what it's done on the track. Obviously, as mentioned earlier, a lot of lap records around the globe. Which ones stand out for you guys?
Question that, crikey.
Wow. I mean, I think what was great. I mean, Ian and I were invited many years ago as guests of the Sepang circuit in Malaysia, and we were walking on the grid and for the Formula One race, and what a great place. Seen it on TV many times. Fast forward the clock 5 years later, we're there with Mono Owners Club, from Hong Kong with 10 drivers. We've got the circuit to ourselves. We've got 10 monos lined up, and the Stig's Chinese cousin goes out in the car, Sean, and just sets this time. And the circuit chairman, he had I think it was a Porsche GT2 or something like that, and he knew what was a quick time around there. And of course, the timing comes up on the screen. And he came down from his office, and he was just shaking his head. He just couldn't believe it. And so I think these big international circuits are certainly very headline grabbing. But I think, just the fact that the car goes to a circuit and has beaten everything all before it. And let's be honest, these are incredibly well-funded, household names, some of the best brands of anything in the world, and people like Porsche and Ferrari and McLaren and so on. And for us to be able to be in that ballpark is one thing, but to be in some cases 3, 4, 5 seconds quicker is quite remarkable. And of course, that's what the car's designed to do. So it should be up there. But nevertheless, it's still amazing. So, Paul Sweeney, one of our customers at Arnaud Duras, this was a circuit that we went to as part of the Mono Owners Club. And for those who don't know, Mono Owners Club is a collection of all the owners around the world who are members, and we could basically go and do various different events around the world, typically 2, 3, 4 days, and there's always, if possible, a track day in there. And Paul had enjoyed, as we had, 2 or 3 days of driving with his mates and driving around France and Germany, and then absolutely battered it around this circuit. And he's not a professional racing driver. He's a quick driver, but he enjoys improving and getting better, and that's what he's done with us. And he walked away with a track record, and that makes me equally as proud as doing any of the other international circuits with professional drivers. If I'm honest, Pete Story recently at Brands Hatch, again, I mean, he drove down in the car from his house. Very relaxed, typical Pete style. Went out there, had a great day's fun. Needed some new tires because he'd not had any different tires on the car ever since he'd owned it in about 3 or 4 years. Put some new tires on. Said, I'm just going to go out and do another couple of laps. Went out and went another couple of seconds quicker, and then drove home. And then we were driving on the M25, and there he goes, bombing past us on the way home. So it's, I don't know, it's different things give you different feelings and different levels, all equally proud, but different for their own individual reasons, I guess.
I think the one that jumps to mind for me, because on most occasions I'm not usually there. Neill tends to be there for these types of things for obvious reasons. I'm the felt tip fairy back at base, as he calls me. I think the Evo lap, obviously I got to see it on the video, but I was getting WhatsApps the whole day from Neill. And that's a good all-round circuit. It's got a really quite long back straight, although there's a bit of a kink in the middle of it, twisty, up and down. So it's not necessarily favors any particular kind of car, but obviously it does suit mono. What I found really interesting was if you looked at, for example, a car like a GT3 RS was a certain time, and then from the same brand, a Porsche 918, which is, you're talking about going from 200 grand to $1 million. It was like a second quicker. their own mark. And you looked at the McLaren, the 675, and then compared that to what the P1 was doing. Same kind of thing, about a second difference. And then we went 5 seconds faster than the hypercars. In fact, we went faster than P1 GTR, and that was the only car that was allowed to run on slicks because it's a track-only car. So the car in second place is on slicks, and everybody else on the list, including us, are on road tires. And that gives me a tingle now when I think about that, because it isn't just this little go-kart track that kind of suits our car or anything. There's a long straight. We can take that kink flat out, which the heavier cars can't. So that helps us as well. And that was a great review by Dickie Mead, and very well driven, very well articulated, and yeah, that was a bit of a milestone for me in lots of ways. Not just the number that came at the end of it, but the recognition that he gave us, and yeah, for lots of reasons, that was something I remember.
Well, I think in summary, Stuart, if you look at the different circuits, you've got they're all different types of circuit. And that for me is the most impressive thing. You know, you look at the new reference lap time that we set at Goodwood, very recently. That's known as a power circuit. You know, predominantly it's fourth, fifth, sixth gear. Down a couple of cogs for the chicane, but predominantly it's a lot to wide open throttle, and it's all about a lot of straight line speed. And yet the car is just so incredibly fast around a so-called power circuit. Yeah, it's also very good at places like Anglesey, which has got a mixture of high speed, low speed corners, etc. And then you've got the big old wide open spaces of Formula One tracks, of your Silverstones and your Sepangs, etc. And that just goes to show that it doesn't matter what the circuit layout is. It doesn't matter what the test is. Actually, that the car will deliver in every single different type of environment.
Okay, moving on to our unexpected guest of the episode and a fundamental player in Mono's performance down the years. Let's have your very educated and undoubtedly very correct guesses.
Is it Mr. Webb by any chance?
Yeah, wild stab in the dark.
Please welcome Oliver Webb.
All right.
Oh, there he is.
Ollie, thank you so much for joining us on the BAC podcast, fresh from the track, as I could see. Listen, I think it's fair to say that your name is somewhat synonymous with BAC, given all you've done with us. How did that journey begin way back when?
That began when I think, Neil, correct me if I get this slightly wrong, but I think my ex-girlfriend at the time, Alice, her friend's farm had the first body, or one of the first body monos being painted in it. And Neil and Alice got to talking, and the next thing I know, Alice is on the phone to me, and then me and Neil ended up on the phone together, I think, there and then on Alice's phone, I think, and then came to try out the car, I think, or came to see the car at Holmes Chapel, and then have a go in it eventually at Alton Park, and then 6-7 years later, there we go. That's the quick version. There's more to it.
It's actually 10 years later, Ollie.
Well, yeah, 10 years to now, yeah.
No, that's absolutely right. I remember, obviously, through a phone call, there's this perception and reality. And of course, Ollie, in his career, is used to talking to the best race teams and all the rest of it. And he's saying, yeah, I'll come down and I'll come and check the car out. So he comes down to our humble beginnings in Holmes Chapel. And I think that might have been a bit of a shock to his system. And then he came in and it was like, right, let's have a meeting then and let's discuss, thinking we'd probably go off to some kind of fancy boardroom somewhere and nice water and all the rest of it. And I was like, okay, let's just sit down here then next to the car. And we sat down and we had a chat and we worked out our commercial terms. And that was it. And then literally after, Ollie was like, right, let's get in it then. Let's see what it feels like. And I found a picture actually of Ollie sat feeling the steering wheel and the instant first thing that, if you remember, about the clutch rest the clutch rest and the heel rest, Ollie was not far out first enough, and that was a quick instant change that we did just on the way the pedal box was and things like that. And then it was down to track testing, and for me, I'll never forget the speed of seeing Ollie around Alton Park. I don't quite know how we ended up having the circuit to ourselves, Ollie. I think your dad came down. We were stood on the inside of Lodge, and just rapid. And for me, it was like we designed our own Formula 3 race car. It was this guy who nearly just won the British Formula 3 championship in our car, the whine of the gearbox and everything else, and just absolutely barreling on. I don't know what your first impressions were like of the car, Ollie.
Yeah, it was a great comparison to have the mechanical grip from a Formula 3 car to refer to, because it was around about that time, wasn't it, or just after it. So yeah, and to be at a track which I knew means that part's out of the way, so you can just focus on the car, and just loved its progressive attitude towards driving. And when you found the limit was there. There was no kind of hidden surprise behind it. And there was also the exciting part as a driver, selfishly, is also making sure there's a little bit of room, which there always is in every car, to make sure you can have your touch on it and your development on it. Because obviously, if you get into something that's already perfect, which nothing I'd say is, then you've got not much work to do. So there was some fine tuning, of course, to be done. There always is, and it made it really exciting. Then we went on to countless days at Myra and the road testing and everything else that went along with it. And the road testing was actually quite, although sounds more boring, was actually quite interesting and exciting for a driver to be able to get that side of the coin, making sure a car that can do what you just, as a racing driver, expect it to just do on the track, but then also be usable on the road. That was the exciting challenge from my perspective, because I'm lucky enough to jump into all sorts on the track. So I naturally just expect something to be at a certain level on the track. So if you're impressed on the track and on the road, then it's a good start, and it was.
We've spent a bit of time, Ollie, before you came on, trying to put into words how it makes you feel when you drive the car on the road and on the track. And Ian and I have given our impressions. I know it's a question that we frequently get asked, what's it like, and so on and so forth. And I know it's difficult, but try and put it into words and describe, the feeling of when you get in the car, how it makes you feel when you're on the road and on the track, and what it is from your side, as a professional driver, but also as a person who likes to drive nice cars on the road and on the track himself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think automotive therapy would be the short version of it, is what I would call it. I think I'm involved in a lot of different types of cars and motorsport and people, and naturally this world of high engineering cars attracts high net worth individuals, and by that same breath, people who probably lead fairly stressful lives, or have done, to achieve what they've achieved. Then they end up with a collection of cars, and then they get introduced to mono, and then you get asked this question. And I think being in something that distracts you in a positive way so much, and that requires, let's say, quite a lot of focus to drive compared to the creature comforts of most supercars, that's an advantage, I'd say, not a disadvantage. If anyone goes, well, where's the radio player and where's this, and all the kind of jokey questions you usually get for a single seater on the road. But it is automotive therapy. When you're driving that thing at a decent pace, on a nice country road, or flat out around the track, you have no choice but to think about the very present and what you're feeling and what you're experiencing. And you can't worry about your emails or family life or what's going on at work or anything like that. You have no choice but to focus on that apex or that line through that road if you're driving a TT course or your favorite country road. So yeah, automotive therapy, that's what I'd call it, which I've never actually said that sentence before, but I'm going to use that again.
I told you he was very eloquent, didn't I? We mentioned earlier that first interview we saw in the Hockenheim paddock with David Coulthard, and you remember that? I think we mentioned it to you. And Eddie Irvine said how eloquent and professionally sounded. That was that. There, you put it exactly right, and that's if you do listen back to the podcast, you'll hear Neill and I how we answered the same question. We said very much the same thing.
Almost like it was scripted, but it really wasn't.
Yeah, no, that was great.
I think it was Charlie Turner, editor of Top Gear magazine, calls it selfish solitude. I think they were the words that he chose. One of my favourite experiences, Ollie, I don't know if you remember this, was when we were doing the ceramic brakes testing, and we had the different pad materials to test. We had 3 different types of brake pad material, and we went to Alton Park. Luckily, we had the benefit of 2 cars. And this was also my home track. I'd won on it many years ago. Probably don't know it as well as Ollie does, but I thought, right, here's my opportunity. And what we did was, we both drove different cars with different pads. We did it blind, and then we both came together to say, the material that we preferred and why, and what our reasons were. And I think I was saying earlier, Ollie, you're there from a professional driver, but you've also got a very good affinity for the type of customer who buys the car. And I think I probably represent that person in terms of my ability and my speed. But prior to this test, you know, I've always dreamt of we all do, don't we? What might have been if life had turned out differently. And it was only when I followed Ollie that I realized the difference between probably a good club driver, which is me, and a seriously professional international driver, which is what Ollie is, and the differences of how they drive and how they approach. And you know, I realized I was braking where Ollie was accelerating, because his perception of what happens out of a corner is equally important as what happens before it. And so trying to do the classic natural thing with amateur drivers of braking that little bit later and trying to carry as much speed as possible into the corner is actually think about what the corner is that's coming out of it. And following Ollie through you know, certain types of corner around Alton Park, I learned so much just in my approach to driving. And I think that's one of the things that our owners need and like to get is feedback when we do Mono Owners Club days with Ollie and things like that of how they can improve their driving and how they can get better.
You just reminded me, do you remember Bilsterberg, Ollie? Yeah. We were there with the technical director of the circuit. He'd worked with Tilke on the design of it, and Ollie went out the pits and just briefly, it's a long curving straight, goes under like a gantry, and then it goes into a hairpin. On the inside of the hairpin is the clubhouse, and we're stood on the terrace of the clubhouse. And Ollie went out, and you can hear him at the back of the circuit. And the technical director, he said, "They're really fast guys. They're braking just as they get to that gantry." And the first lap, Ollie came round and he changed up into 6 at the gantry, and the guy he went, "Oh, and he stepped away from the handrail." and then I jumped on it over the curves, off he went, and he looked at me and he was like, "What?" Because we told him he could have a drive later on. I think he suddenly started getting a bit scared.
Oh yeah, Bilsterberg feels like I would have loved to if I had the time, and I probably should have done. But like you guys were saying, obviously I'm at the track today, so I've pretty much just come straight in from a session. But I would have loved to have gone back through my phone before this podcast, because you guys are probably going to jog my memory of loads of different times, and I'll have to jog my memory when you ask me the questions of it. But I would have loved to have spent half an hour before this call. I'll probably end up doing it afterwards, although that's not as relevant for your guys' podcast, of all the different trips and stories, and the kind of, there's almost too many going on in my head to actually bring them up. But even when you're talking about the brake testing, I remember going to Bruntingthorpe either before or after those Alton Park days, and measuring between the steels. And I remember when we did the first brake test, and we just thought, it's got to be wrong, we've got to test it again, and maybe the cones are laid out wrong, I remember we went out and got a different measuring stick, one of those things that roll with the wheel, because we would just thought there's no way that this car is stopping 30 meters earlier on the first day of testing the new carbon ceramics, as well as the weight difference. Yeah, really interesting. I mean, and the fact that of how much lighter those, the bit that we almost forgot to address in a positive way is that we're so focused on making the braking better in the car that when we were doing those lap times at Alton Park and we were measuring the brake distances, and we're thinking, well, where's the other 1.5 seconds coming from? And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, Jesus, it's like 2.5 kilos lighter a corner. So maybe it's just the fact that the whole car's so much lighter now as well. Yeah, good times testing those brakes.
Let me jog your memory with another one, which I'll never forget. Obviously, when we at Goodwood, we'd run a few times up the hill. In fact, in the very first year, I drove up in a shirt, you know, when it was allowed in 2011. But they created a class, race cars for the road, because we were all a lot quicker than the supercars. And I remember saying to Ollie, if you crash, we'll kill you, but we'll kill you if you lose as well. God bless him. He went out and did the quickest time. But maybe you can talk about that running up the hill.
Yeah, it's often kind of the phrase that you hear as a driver, especially with development parts for cars and everything. At the start of a lot of people's journeys for both manufacturers and race cars, is things tend to be one of one, and obviously a slogan that goes hand in hand with mono, but also goes hand in hand with starting a company is you've got to have the wow factor in there, but also make sure that it's still in one piece at the end, because it's a big task for a newish firm, even at that stage, to rebuild your special car when you're in the process of getting the customers' cars out there as well. But Goodwood is a very special place, and probably the best place to do that with. But unfortunately, it's the least forgiving in that sense, and the same with the Goodwood Motor Circuit as well, and Nordschleife. It's frustrating that all of these records that people want to get are at the most dangerous tracks. It'd be great if everyone just went to Silverstone with a load of runners, and if you get it wrong, you can just try again. But yeah, Goodwood is half the car tends to be on the grass half the time. The rest of it's clipping hay bales. And I remember after we did that, well, it ended up being, for 4, 5, 6 years afterwards at Goodwood. But I remember that first proper year that we went for that time at Goodwood and we won. And I remember each run, building up to it and getting closer and closer. And then eventually in the last 2 runs, I remember, I think I was with Neill and Sam at the time, and we were picking hay from between the rim and the tyre, where the tire's just folding over its edge. And then as the car was gripping back up and the tyre wall was straightening back up, it was pulling hay out of the tyre barrier in between it. So we knew we were finding the limit there without scratching any of the car, but with still getting hay in between it. And with a car that's, yes, you can see the arches, but the peripheral vision when you're going through that tunnel of the Flint Wall of Goodwood is, very tough, very tough.
It's an amazing skill, actually, I've got to say. I mean, when you drive around the circuit, you say to yourself, I'll brake a bit later, or I'll get on the power a bit earlier or whatever. But to basically parade yourself around and on a stand and meet customers and all the rest of it, and then put your helmet on and just literally switch on for 45 seconds. It's I think we've said before, Ollie, it's an incredible skill to be able to just turn your brain on instantly and just be within millimeters of where you were the previous run. It's so impressive. I almost put my Oliver Webb t-shirt on, actually, the one that we did to celebrate the Goodwood win. Today, but no, I think Goodwood stands out for me as always. I mean, and more recently, Ollie, there was the lap, last week, which again, blindingly fast, and the feedback we've had from what we've posted is, people are thinking that the footage is sped up, and it's like, no, this is real, and you look at where the car is positioned, and there's not much more on the table. And Ollie famously got out and said that's a quick lap. And he said 10 years and I've still not put a scratch on a car, I think was his famous words.
Famous last words. Yeah. Just one thing I want to ask Ollie, because I've got to make a confession. I've driven prototype versions of Mono R when that engine was in a regular last generation Mono, what we refer to as Mono W. And I've driven at various stages, but I've actually never driven the production ready Mono R. And so I'd be interested from your point of view, what is the difference? What is the step change from a Mono W to Mono R? I mean, just for your reference, I found a lap of Goodwood Alex West going round in his original 2.3 Cosworth engine Mono, and he's doing like nearly 130, 128, 129, something like that. And you did a 150. And of course, you're a professional driver and stuff, but can you characterize the differences for me, actually, because I've not driven the production car?
You boys are just nicking all my questions, by the way. I've got everything written down ready to ask and just crossing things out. Go on, Ollie, after you.
I'd say more lively is the key feature of it. Obviously, it's less weight, more racy, and the power difference. I think the thing when we were developing the 2.3 that was always the case was, as always drivers ask for, is I just wanted more power from it. And I think if it had been engineered worse and had less grip, you'd feel like the 2.3 was already a very quick car. But because it was engineered well and had so much grip, you almost kind of made a rod for your own back, because then it had so much grip that even flat out with a load of lock, it kind of just stuck and went. So it did the lap time, but in a slightly less emotionally captivating way. So it would do the Top Gear lap time, it would be P1, it would get all of its lap records. And even the case where some customers would drive in and go, yeah, it feels quick, really impressive. And then you get out and be like, oh, by the way, you were 3 seconds quicker than you were in your P1. You're like, what? There's no way. And there was a slight disconnect in that feeling between how quick it actually is versus how quick it feels. It would just do it. With the R, the biggest difference there is that you do feel that power. It's more lively. If you go flat out with a load of lock-in, it will bite, which is a natural curve and progression of a car that you then, you've got to the limit almost of the grip, and you need to then give it a bit more power. And that's what this feels like it's got. So if you blindfold me and throw me from a 2.3 into a Mono R, it feels like it's been stripped of 100 kg and given 100 horsepower more. That's just the raw feeling you get from it. So I'd say it's a tougher car to drive, but anyone who wants that last couple of percent, that's what the R gives you.
Interesting. You just reminded me also of, do you remember, because I mentioned Alex West, we were at Anglesey and he was in his P1 and he was going quick, and everyone said, oh, you're going really quick. And he said, yeah, but I'd be quicker in my mono. And I was like, really? And he's like, yeah. And then I think you went out in mono and he followed you. No, he went out in the P1, you followed him for a lap, and then you swapped over and you went in front and just drove away from him. Yeah, that was a good day as well. He was great like that. Alex was. He was, he was happy to admit that this less expensive single seat car was quicker than his pride and joy at the time. It was.
Yeah. And our dad was actually sat in the front seat next to Alex when he did that. He said, I just couldn't believe. He said, Alex is absolutely on the brakes and all the ABS is all cutting in. He said, and then Ollie just flies up the inside of us. And then after a couple of corners, he's like 2 seconds down the road, So yeah, Stuart, I think you've got to ask one of your questions.
I've run out. They're all gone.
We'll just reminisce otherwise.
Now I'll put you on the spot, Ollie. You've had obviously 10 years with us and driving mono, had a lot of success around the world. And to put you on the spot, as I said, what is your favorite moment of them all?
Oh, I don't know. I'll probably list off about 7 now. I'll start saying one and then I'll think of another. The one that comes to mind is some of the ice driving events that we've done. What makes it fun, as much as there was a lot of stress involved as well, what makes it fun is being part of something from the start. So when we started new ventures like the ice driving stuff, rather than being hired by a company, hey, come and drive this car, and the track already, the event, and you're just driving the car. It's helping organize the event happen and being involved in the stuff in the background. So everything's new, everything's exciting. And the ice driving event, when we first went, I think originally it came as a birth child from doing a Top Gear event where we went to their location, did their event, and then thought, you know what, mono actually was mega on the ice and everyone else loved it. Let's make our own event. And I think the surrealness of that first Top Gear event, less so on the actual ice itself, but more driving on the roads to get to the ice lake in this thing that just should not in any way whatsoever be on that road. And just sliding it sideways with a straight through pipe, old WRC style sound, when you're told to just be sensible and cruise down to the lake, and then Ian can hear him while he's having his breakfast, the sound, the car belting through the trees down towards the lake. That's quite a standout moment, because that was really fun being in those roads with that car. Of course, the Top Gear lap, going and testing and doing that, and that being the quickest was great for all the team. That was very, very early on. I don't know. There's so many different trips, and but I think the ice driving stuff was the craziest thing that we've done with that car. I'm quite out of my comfort zone, because at that point I hadn't done rallycross or rallying like I've done a little bit now. And with that car and with the studs in the tires, and we were hand studding the tires at that point, because there was just no tire manufacturer ready with our size rim with arches above them, with that ride height that would work. So we were hand studding them and all that. So the whole venture to leading towards being on an ice lake in that car was exciting. And Neill almost falling into the lake on a little tricycle that he found on the side of the lake, and all sorts of funny stories.
And snowboarding behind Ollie
on
a tow rope, doing about 60 miles an hour on the ice, while Ollie was going sideways with one hand and filming it with his phone on the other, and I'm hanging off the back. That was quite fun. The other one for me, Ollie, was when do you remember? I still can't remember. We actually did this at the Hungaroring when we were making a film. I had the stupid idea of getting a tow off Ollie on a skateboard. So Ollie started to drive off down the pit lane. And then he was going quite a reasonable, normal pace, and I'm holding on this skateboard. Then Ollie he gets to the exit, and of course he's got to accelerate, and off he goes. But little did I know that obviously the circuit at Hungaroring is on a hill, and incredibly, I actually made it round to turn 5. Which is the corner that Felipe Massa had his incident. So I come barreling into the first corner on this skateboard, and then I can hear in the background, "Aap, aap," and I'm thinking, I'm either going to die on this skateboard, I'm going to die because Ollie's going to run me over. So that was another good memory for me.
The other 2 stories that do spring to mind are, one was, I remember when we did the first Wales Rally GB event, of which we ended up doing about 3. And I knew how much rallying meant to Neill and Ian at that time. Less so to me. I was into rallying, but I wasn't brought up on it. And we actually got to do part of the half tarmac, half like muddy gravel style stage that the WRC cars had done. And Neill, being the anorak he was timing them all as they were all coming through. And then when we went to do our show runs, we asked if we could go last for our show run and pretend the cars turned off and I'm just restarting it or whatever, so we could actually try and get a stage time to see what we were like. And finding out that we were like mid-pack in World Rally in a single seater on road tires, gunning it in between the walls, drifting it sideways at what was meant to be like a 30-mile-an-hour maximum speed limit with all these flags flying. That was great. And then what was the other one that I was going to say? Oh yeah, the other moment, which is now fun to look back on, at the time was some of the worst moments ever, but back with the very, very first car, with issues that we're blessed that we don't have today, but 120 odd cars ago, I don't know how many cars you guys are on now, but back with car 1 when we were struggling with and practicing with radiator sizes and different alternator sizes and fittings and where they go. And I remember we had to go and display the car. I think it was at outside Mercedes F1 for an event, which again, in the usual Neill fashion, told me it was about 5 miles down the road, but I think it was about 200 miles away or something. And I remember getting in the car, driving there in the day, no problem, a little bit cold, a little bit of snow, and then came to drive back in winter, and it was pitch black, hailing, and the lights were starting to dip because the alternator wasn't quite right back then. So then I would use a little bit more revs to try and keep the lights up, but then the radiators weren't cooling down the temps quite enough. So then if I used too much revs, it would overheat the car. So it was this balance for 200 miles in this car on a trade plate 10 years ago of trying to keep the lights just bright enough with enough revs to keep the alternator and the battery working, but without overheating the radiators, to the point where I think it was the longest journey ever. I remember having Neill on loudspeaker with my little earphones inside under the helmet, trying to use my iPhone torch out the front of the car to light up the journey. And it just makes me think, when you kind of take day to day, but then if you flash back 10 years ago and look at there with your iPhone torch hanging out the front of the car to try and see where you're going, to now breaking all these lap records and not even thinking twice about that stuff, it makes it fun, a fun memory, although it wasn't at the time.
I remember you coming in the unit in Holmes Chapel, and you were not best pleased, and you were shivering. I think he had his college scarf on around underneath his race suits and various different layers that he had on, and he kind of came in sheepishly and shaking, saying, "There's the keys, mate. I'm going home for a shower." that was the end of that one.
Ollie, I know you've got to get back to the circuit, so we'll say thank you and goodbye for now. But listen, thank you so much for joining us, and I apologise in advance because I am going to steal your automotive therapy line forever in my PR work. So thank you so much, mate. We'll see you soon for sure.
Good to see you, Ollie.
Yeah, good to see you. Good. Yeah, thanks for finding the time, Ollie. And it goes without saying, it's been an absolute pleasure. 10 years of great times and more lap records and great memories to come.
Yeah, look forward to them.
And that's that for the performance episode of the BAC podcast. Another really interesting episode, boys.
Yeah, it was great to relive those memories with Ollie. And it's funny, isn't it? Every time someone mentions a word, Neill mentioned Solitude. So I remember a memory of driving back from Solitude, or Ollie mentioned something and you remember things, or we jog his memory. We've done so much stuff together. It was great to relive that with him, actually.
Yeah, no, I agreed. I think with this whole thing, you know, reflections is a great thing, and it also reinforces the progress that you've made. And it's been great that Ollie's been part of the journey almost from the start to the present. So it's great having him on, and great reflecting on some of the great driving experiences that we've had on the road and on the track, and many more to come.
For sure. Next time out, we're diving a little bit deeper into driving and focusing on the experience. So that's looking into events from around the world, like drifting on the frozen lakes in Sweden. I need to hear that tricycle story properly as well. And tackling the Atlantic road trip with the Mono Owners Club. Some great stories to be told for sure. We'll catch you guys next time.